It is now Black History Month, and I've got a question that I want to ask my viewers who happen to be Black, who happen to be African American, because I feel like I'm not qualified to answer the question. I'll ask it, but I don't feel I'm qualified to answer. So here would be my question. What does it take to qualify as an African American? What does it take to qualify to be a Black American? So here's the problem with that question. When that question is typically asked, we hear what does it take to qualify. Really, what does it take to quantify is really how people are naturally going to try to answer that question. And one might say, well, as long as you've got, one ancestor that's of African ancestry, then that means you're Black. So you could have every known ancestor you have in your family tree that's Black. You could have one parent, you could have one grandparent. And then ultimately though, we get into a situation, as this channel often talks about, DNA test results. What if we have a person who didn't even know they had African DNA, and then they find out? So like my wife, for example, okay? And I think this is a great example for where I'm going with this question, why it's so complex. My wife is white. She takes a DNA test, and she's, 2.5% African descent. Okay, so she's white, and she has a small amount of African DNA. A lot of people who are white are finding out that they do. But does that mean that they're suddenly African American? Does that suddenly mean that they're Black American? And then we're in the triple spot of that Q word, quantify, not qualify as Black American. So if you're 2.5% African descent, are you Black American? I think most people would say no. But I think if you had one grandparent that was, then you're safe. I mean, basically it seems that there is this invisible amount of DNA, African DNA, that it takes to qualify. It kind of feels that way. But it's a very complex issue. I'll give you an example. Halle Berry, okay? Her father, Black. Her mother, white. Raised by her mother, who is white. She identifies as African American. But yet she was raised by a white parent. Still, she identifies with the Black experience because, from what I'm understanding, that's often what it takes to identify as a Black American, is that you grow up with that experience of growing up as Black. So other than her appearance, which, again, one parent is white, one parent is Black, as far as culturally, we could say maybe she's more culturally white, but her DNA shows otherwise. And I think that's another part of this equation, is that there's a culture involved, right? As far as the Black experience, typically there's Black culture and then there's mainstream culture. And most of us can look around and see the difference. We can see that cultural difference. So it's like we've got a couple different things to really look at. We've got to look at, does the person actually have African DNA? Did they grow up identifying as Black? I think that could honestly be part of it. And then ultimately, do they identify with Black culture? Not only the experience of growing up and being perceived that way, but also the culture of it. Now again, I could be totally wrong because I'm not qualified to answer this question, but I think the problem in trying to ask this question is immediately people want to go to, how much African descent do you have? And it's not that easy, is it? Because again, we're getting into reverse one-drop rule, which is clearly problematic. But it would also be problematic if someone who was otherwise white suddenly looks at a DNA test and says, oh, I'm 4% African descent. I guess I can identify as African American now. Well, I would think most Black Americans would say, no, that doesn't make you Black. But then again, what if you're a white American who got your DNA test and, oh, I'm 12%. Like, at some point that percentage crosses over and now you can identify, right? I don't know. Who am I asking specifically though? I'm not asking other white people. I'm asking people who identify as Black, who are Black Americans. Help me understand, what does it take to qualify to be a Black American? And if you could help me out, as far as that percentage of DNA, does that go into play here? Otherwise, we're in a Rachel Dolezal situation too. You can't just identify if you don't have something to back it up. Your response belongs right here.